The day began like any other in the cramped, cluttered newsroom where Theo Denson spent most of his time. The cold morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows on his desk, littered with half-empty coffee cups and scattered notes. The hum of the office buzzed in the background, the familiar rhythm of 1,000 stories that would never make it to print. Theo was used to this. He had been a journalist long enough to know that most of the stories he chased didn't end with a breakthrough. They often dissolved into the ether, never seen again. But this one felt different. It started innocuously enough, an offhand comment made by an actor in passing, a name dropped into a casual conversation at an after-party. The actor, Trevor Drake, was well known for his role in a forgettable action series, but his fame didn't matter. What mattered was the slip-up. As Theo sipped his drink at the bar, he overheard Trevor speaking to a fellow actor. His voice was low, almost conspiratorial, but Theo's sharp ears caught the words Angelina Jolie and unpaid debts. The name was unmistakable. Jolie was, without a doubt, one of the most famous women in the world. Her fame had been cemented by years of acting, charity work, and high-profile relationships. To the public, she was an icon, a woman with an unblemished reputation, admired for her humanitarian efforts and admired on red carpets across the world. But Trevor's words, spoken so quietly that only Theo could hear, carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. Theo's instincts kicked in. As an investigative journalist, he knew a story when he heard one. He didn't know yet how deep it ran, but he could tell that something was off. Unpaid debts was not a phrase that should be associated with someone like Angelina Jolie. It was a phrase that indicated things being hidden, things being covered up. For the next few days, Theo couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he became certain that there was more to Jolie than the public had been led to believe. Everyone had seen the glossy photographs, the heartwarming charity events, the perfect family. But what if there was another side? What if the stories he'd heard about her, whispers of secretive ties to dangerous figures, were true? Theo's search for answers began quietly. He started by digging through old files and articles. He spent hours at the local archives, combing through any information that could provide context to the vague clues he had. What he found only deepened the mystery. There were mentions of Angelina Jolie attending exclusive parties, meetings with foreign dignitaries that seemed oddly out of place, and sudden disappearances from the public eye. There were no concrete details, nothing that tied everything together, but it was enough to start a fire in his mind. Something was being hidden. He knew that the first step in any investigation was to build connections, and in this world of Hollywood elites and powerful figures, the right connections were everything. Theo reached out to a few trusted sources, former assistants, people who had been involved in the industry years ago, hoping someone might shed light on the situation. Most of them offered only vague responses, brushing off his inquiries with the typical, "I don't know anything," or "I haven't seen her in years." But then he reached out to Michael Harris, a former manager in the industry who had worked closely with Jolie early in her career. Michael had since left the limelight and vanished from public memory, but Theo knew that if anyone could give him insight into the truth, it was Michael. They met at a small cafe on the edge of the city, away from the prying eyes of the industry. Michael looked older than Theo remembered, his face lined with age, his hair thinning. He had always been a reserved man, but now there was a nervous energy about him. He hesitated before sitting down, looking over his shoulder as if expecting someone to follow him. Theo sensed a deep unease in the air. Michael's voice was low as he leaned in. "You shouldn't be looking into this, Theo. Trust me, you're digging into something that's better left alone. Jolie's a bigger deal than anyone realizes. She's always been more than just an actress. She's involved with people you don't want to know about," Theo pressed, trying to glean more from Michael's caution. "What do you mean, involved? I've heard rumors, but nothing concrete. I need something more, Michael. What's her past really like?" Michael looked around once more before sighing deeply. "She was never just a star. She's part of something darker, something I can't fully explain. When she first started, people tried to protect her image, but after a while she became involved in things that go beyond movies and charity work. Her public life, it's just a front, Theo. There's a whole other world behind that smile, a world where the rules don't apply. Theo's pulse quickened. The pieces he had been gathering were starting to form something much bigger, something far more complicated. Michael's warnings didn't deter him. They only pushed him further. There was a door here that needed to be opened, and he was going to open it no matter what it took. Theo left the cafe, his mind racing with possibilities. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces didn't seem to fit. He knew there was something deeper, something about Angelina Jolie that no one had ever dared to question. And now he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no longer just about uncovering a personal secret. This was about something bigger than a scandal, something that could shake the foundations of an industry built on falsehoods and deception. As Theo continued his search, he began digging into more obscure corners of Jolie's life, looking for any connection to suspicious figures or shady dealings. He found references to meetings with political figures who were known for their controversial decisions, secretive business dealings with people whose names had never been publicly tied to her. Theo's hands shook as he looked over the evidence. None of it was enough to expose a clear pattern, but there was no mistaking the implications. There were too many connections, too many strange absences from the public eye to ignore. Then, after a particularly long day of digging through old reports, Theo found something that made his heart stop. It was a government document from several years ago, a report that had been buried and largely forgotten. In it, Jolie's name appeared alongside Viktor Mirov, a known figure with ties to underground networks in Eastern Europe. Mirov was a name that made many in the intelligence world nervous. His operations were vast, covering everything from arms trafficking to money laundering. He was the type of person one would not expect to find in the same circles as a Hollywood star. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. What if Jolie's charity work and public image were just an elaborate facade? What if, behind it all, she had been hiding her involvement in something far darker? The truth felt like a bomb waiting to go off, and Theo had just found the fuse. He sat there in his small, dimly lit office, his hands trembling slightly. Theo knew that there was no turning back now. The story was real. It was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And with it came a question that gnawed at him. Was he prepared to expose it, no matter the cost? He couldn't sleep that night. The more he turned the possibilities over in his mind, the more he realized that everything had changed. He wasn't just chasing a story anymore. He was about to uncover a truth that could tear apart the very image of the woman the world had adored for so long. But as Theo continued to process the facts, one thing became clear. Someone, somewhere, would do anything to stop him from uncovering. The question now was how far he was willing to go to expose the truth. Theo spent the next few days in a whirlwind of research, determined to follow the threads that he had begun to unravel. The chilling realization about Angelina Jolie's ties to Viktor Mirov, an underground figure with a dark past, lingered in his mind. Each discovery felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place, but with every new piece, the truth became more elusive, slipping further out of his grasp. His apartment had turned into a war room, walls lined with documents, photographs, and notes that began to form a web of connections, each one leading somewhere darker than the last. He had always known that digging into someone like Jolie's past would be dangerous. She was too high profile, too well protected by her carefully cultivated image, to be exposed easily. But now, Theo felt as though he were walking through a fog, and the deeper he went, the more the fog seemed to thicken. His every move felt monitored. The eerie feeling of being watched began to grow stronger, and the weight of the investigation hung over him like a storm cloud, ominous and ever approaching. The first sign that things had escalated came when he arrived at his office one morning to find that his computer had been tampered with. He could tell the moment he sat down. The screen flickered before going black, the files that had taken him weeks to compile disappearing into the void. Panic gripped him, but he quickly suppressed it. Whoever had been watching him was now trying to slow him down. Theo spent hours trying to recover his files, but nothing worked. His only option was to start over. But as the hours dragged on, and he found nothing, the reality hit him. Whoever was behind this knew how to erase everything. His heart sank, but determination surged through him. He couldn't afford to stop now. If anything, this only confirmed how deep the investigation had gone and how dangerous the truth might be. By the time he reached out to his sources again, Theo knew it was time to take the investigation to the next level. He couldn't keep working in isolation. He needed to find someone who could help him access the kind of information that was being systematically erased from the public record. That's when he contacted an old informant, someone he knew who had ties to the world of hackers and cybersecurity. Sebastian Gray had once worked as a data analyst for a high-profile law firm, but had fallen out of favor after a controversial case. Theo trusted him, and more importantly, he knew that Sebastian had the skills to get past the digital defenses that seemed to be closing in on him. They met at a small cafe in an alleyway far from the prying eyes of the city. Sebastian looked different from the last time Theo had seen him. His eyes were more guarded, his usual confidence replaced by a nervous tension. The moment Theo sat down, Sebastian leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. He spoke, quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "Listen, Theo," he began, glancing around the cafe nervously. "I know what you're into, and I'm telling you, you're going to regret this if you don't stop." Theo listened, his eyes narrowing in determination. He couldn't back down now. "I need access to the deeper records, anything that's been erased, any trace of her ties to Viktor Mirov, any government documents or connections I can't get to through regular channels." Sebastian's expression darkened, and for a moment, he didn't respond. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and thick, before he finally spoke again, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with. Mirov? He's not just some criminal, he has ties everywhere. Law enforcement, high-ranking politicians, corporate execs. What you're trying to dig up? It's not just illegal, it's lethal." Theo leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I don't care what it takes. I need to know what's going on. This isn't just about exposing a story, this is bigger than that. It's about everything she's hiding and who she's hiding it from." Sebastian stared at him for a moment, and then with a resigned sigh, he reached into his bag and pulled out a small device, a thumb drive. He slid it across the table to Theo. "This will get you into a few databases. It's not much, but it should be enough for now. But be careful. You're walking on a razor's edge. If they find out what you're doing, you'll disappear." "Theo, you won't get a warning." Theo picked up the thumb drive, nodding silently as he tucked it into his pocket. "I appreciate it. I'll be careful." Sebastian hesitated, his fingers twitching, and then he stood up, glancing over his shoulder one last time before walking out of the cafe without another word. With the new tool in hand, Theo returned to his apartment, his pulse quickening as he plugged the device into his computer. The files began to open up one by one. Encrypted documents, blacked-out records, private communications. He could feel the heat rising in his chest as the truth began to unfold in front of him. There were emails, financial records, and secret contracts that tied Jolie to Viktor Mirov and his network. It wasn't just a business deal. It was a partnership that extended far beyond what he had originally imagined. Theo discovered meetings between the two of them, held in locations so far off the grid that they hadn't been on any public record. Hidden messages, accounts, and strange bank transactions connected them. Each document painted a clearer picture of a woman whose public life was nothing more than a carefully crafted mask. The documents didn't just show ties to criminal organizations. They suggested that Jolie had been involved in illicit activities spanning multiple countries. The deeper Theo dug, the darker the story became. These weren't just whispered rumors. These were facts, cold and irrefutable. It was clear now that Angelina Jolie was not the person the public thought she was. The world had been fed a carefully controlled narrative, and Theo had just pulled back the curtain to reveal something much darker. But as the last few pages of the documents loaded, something else caught Theo's eye. The name on the final page wasn't one he had expected to see. It was Michael Harris, the very person who had warned him to stop looking into Jolie's past. His name had been on several documents, including a series of encrypted messages between Jolie and Mirov. Michael had been involved in these dealings far more than Theo had ever imagined. A cold shiver ran down Theo's spine. What had Michael meant when he told him to stop? How deep had he been involved in this hidden world? And more importantly, why had he stayed silent about it all these years? Theo sat back in his chair staring at the screen, trying to process the enormity of what he had just discovered. His phone buzzed with a notification, breaking his concentration. When he checked it, his heart dropped. It was a single message from an unknown number. Stop digging. You won't like what happens next. For a moment, Theo felt a pang of fear, but it quickly passed, replaced by an overwhelming sense of purpose. He had to keep going. The truth was out there, buried beneath layers of secrecy and power, and Theo was going to expose it, no matter the cost. But now he knew something else. He was not the only one who was watching. Theo spent the following days trying to stay one step ahead of the shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The message he had received had not been the kind of warning he had expected. It was direct, blunt, and threatening, but beneath it there was something more, something personal. It wasn't just a generic threat. Whoever had sent it knew exactly who he was and what he had uncovered. The new documents he had gained access to had revealed more than just business transactions and shady dealings. There was a pattern that emerged, a trail of people who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and who had at some point been linked to both Angelina Jolie and Viktor Mirov. It became apparent that this wasn't just about Jolie's hidden past. It was about a system of power that had been built up over decades, with deep roots in the black market, political influence, and organized crime. And Theo had just scratched the surface. The unease that had been growing inside him now felt like an undeniable truth. The moment he crossed the line into uncovering the conspiracy, he realized that everything around him was being watched. Could no longer go to the same places, no longer make calls without checking over his shoulder. It wasn't just his digital life that had been compromised. Theo began to notice that even his physical movements had started to feel scrutinized. He had always been the type to trust his instincts, and those instincts were now screaming at him. Every time he left his apartment, Theo felt the stares. It wasn't paranoia. It was a fact. He had stopped going to his regular cafe, switched up his routes, and even avoided the street corner where he always used to pick up his morning paper. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always right behind him, just out of sight. On a Thursday afternoon, Theo was walking back from a meeting with another source, a man who claimed to have insider knowledge about Mirov's operations. He had told Theo that there were rumors of a deal going down in the coming weeks, and that Jolie's involvement wasn't just passive. She was apparently being pulled deeper into something that could bring her crashing down, if the public ever found out. Theo had written down all the details, his mind racing with the implications. As he rounded the corner near his building, Theo suddenly felt a strange sensation, a prickling on the back of his neck. He couldn't explain it, but the hairs on his arms stood up and his heart began to race. He didn't look back, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. His mind raced. Was it just the paranoia creeping in, or had someone really been tailing him? His instincts told him to act fast. He ducked into an alley, walking quickly to put distance between himself and the street. But as he walked, the sound of footsteps behind him quickened. Turning a corner sharply, he entered an old bookstore, hoping to blend in for a moment. His breathing was shallow, his chest tight with anxiety. He scanned the shelves, pretending to look at books, but his mind was racing. With thoughts of the danger that was closing in on him, Theo found a quiet corner and pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he checked for any missed calls or messages. He had barely finished checking when the door to the bookstore opened, and a figure stepped in. It wasn't someone Theo recognized. The man was tall, wearing a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a bookstore. The man's presence was too out of place, too deliberate. He scanned the aisles, moving with purpose as though looking for something, or someone. Theo's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. Whoever the man was, he was here for Theo. He could feel it in his bones. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't just a random threat. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Theo backed away slowly, trying to keep out of sight. His mind raced. He needed a plan. He couldn't let the man see him, and he couldn't risk getting caught. With a shaky breath, Theo slipped out the back door of the bookstore, taking the alley that led behind the building. He needed to think. He needed to get back to his apartment and figure out what to do next. But as he hurried down the alley, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him again. He wasn't being paranoid. Whoever was after him was closing in. Theo took a sharp left, darting into another alleyway and quickly slipping between two buildings. His heart raced and his thoughts became a blur. He didn't stop to think. He just moved, pushing himself harder, faster, through the winding maze of streets and alleys. Finally, he reached a street that was quieter, less trafficked. He looked over his shoulder and, seeing no one in pursuit, slowed his pace. His mind was still spinning, adrenaline pumping through his veins. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so exposed, so vulnerable. The reality of the situation had settled in. Whoever was watching him, whoever had been keeping tabs on his every move, was getting closer. The game had changed. It wasn't just about the investigation anymore. It was about his survival. When Theo reached his apartment, he locked the door behind him, but it didn't feel secure. The reality of the situation had settled in. Whoever was watching him, whoever had been keeping tabs on his every move, was getting closer. The game had changed. It wasn't just about the investigation anymore. It was about his survival. As he stood there in his small apartment, breathing heavily and trying to collect his thoughts, he realized he had no choice but to escalate things. He couldn't keep hiding in the shadows. It was time to confront the truth head-on, no matter the consequences. Theo had always prided himself on his ability to find the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. But now he understood that the truth he was seeking had its own dangers. The people involved were far more powerful than he had anticipated. They had a network that extended beyond anything Theo had ever dealt with. And worse, he was now a part of that network, a piece in their dangerous game. His phone buzzed with a new message. He picked it up, his hands still shaking slightly. "You've been warned, Theo. Last chance to back off. Stop digging or we'll make sure you never get to tell the story." The words on the screen blurred for a moment as Theo's mind raced. It was clear now that they weren't just threatening him. They were watching, tracking every move he doing. This was no longer just a simple investigation. This was war. Theo stared at the phone, his finger hovering over the screen. He could walk away. He could abandon the investigation, go back to the safety of his old life, and forget everything. But he knew he couldn't. He had already come too far. There was no turning back now. With resolve settling into his chest, Theo placed the phone down, his mind set. He wasn't going to let them stop him. He was going to expose the truth, no matter the cost. But as he began to prepare for the next steps, the weight of the danger surrounding him became undeniable. There was no more hiding. He was in the trap now, and there was no easy way out. The days following Theo's decision felt like a blur of endless tension and fraying nerves. The danger he had tried to ignore was no longer something that existed in the periphery. It was here, now, right in front of him. The warnings had escalated, each one more menacing than the last. But Theo couldn't stop himself. He had uncovered too much about Angelina Jolie, about the world she had woven around herself, to let it go. The truth had to come out. No matter what, Theo spent most of the next few days pacing through his apartment, trying to piece together the final elements of the investigation. Each document, each encrypted file, only deepened his understanding of how intertwined Jolie was with Viktor Mirov and his network. But as the pieces came together, something else became clear. This wasn't just about her connections to crime and corruption. This was about power, control, and the lengths to which people would go to protect what they had built. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Jolie had positioned herself at the heart of a system that reached into the highest echelons of both the public and private sectors. She wasn't just an actor, not just a philanthropist. She was a player in a dangerous game, one whose stakes were higher than anyone outside of this world could comprehend. The path she had chosen had blurred the lines between good and evil, and Theo had been dragged into the heart of it. One night, as Theo sat at his desk staring at his computer screen, the hum of the city outside seemed muffled, almost distant. He was exhausted, drained from days of unrelenting research and sleepless nights, but he couldn't stop. His hands hovered over the keyboard as he reviewed the final set of documents he had retrieved. The culmination of everything, Mirov's operations, Jolie's secret ties to him, the people who had disappeared, the money that had been laundered, was all in front of him. One more story, one more article, and the truth would be out. But as his finger hovered over the send button, the weight of his decision hit him. There was no going back. Once the article was out, once the world saw what he had uncovered about Angelina Jolie's hidden past, there would be no turning back for her either. Her carefully constructed life would crumble, and with it the lives of everyone involved in her dark dealings. Just as Theo began to type a final line, there was a soft knock at the door. His body tensed instinctively. He had been expecting this, had known it would come sooner or later, but the moment still caught him off guard. He stood up slowly, the room feeling smaller, the air heavier. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Theo moved cautiously toward the door, his mind racing. He wasn't sure who was standing on the other side, but he knew one thing for certain. Whoever it was, they were part of the world he had stumbled into. The world that revolved around people like Angelina Jolie, untouchable, powerful, and dangerous. He opened the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing there, framed by the dim hallway light, was a man he had seen only once before, Gabriel Carter. The businessman who had appeared on several of the encrypted documents he had uncovered, and whose name was linked to some of the most powerful figures in the world. Carter's face was cold, expressionless, but his eyes betrayed a hint of recognition. He knew exactly who Theo was. "You've been looking for answers," Carter said, his voice calm, almost casual. "But some things are better left buried, Mr. Denson." Theo's instincts screamed at him to slam the door shut, to run, to do anything that would keep him safe. But his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen in place as the realization sank in. Carter wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here for a friendly chat. He was here to make sure Theo never exposed what he had learned. "I'm not afraid of you," Theo said, his voice low but steady. The words felt hollow in his mouth, but he had no choice. He had come this far, and there was no stopping now. Carter smiled, a thin, knowing smile that only made Theo's skin crawl. "You should be. You have no idea who you're dealing with, Mr. Denson. This isn't just about Jolie, you know. You've uncovered something that goes deeper than you think." The name hung in the air like a heavy weight. Angelina Jolie. Theo had known from the start that she was at the center of something vast and dangerous, but hearing Carter say her name so casually, so coldly, sent a shiver through him. He had uncovered the truth, and now the truth was coming for him. Carter stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. "You think you can expose her? You think you can take down everything we've built? You have no idea what will happen to you if you do." Theo swallowed hard, but his resolve didn't falter. "I'm not backing down. Not now. Not after everything I've seen. You won't silence me." Carter's expression darkened, the warmth of his smile replaced by something colder, more menacing. "You don't get to choose how this ends, Theo. People like you don't understand the power that someone like Jolie wields. You think you're just uncovering a simple scandal, but you're playing with fire." Theo stood his ground, his chest tightening, I don't care about her power, I care about the truth. Carter's eyes narrowed. The truth doesn't matter to people like her or to people like me. The only thing that matters is control. The air between them thickened with an unspoken threat. And for a long moment, Theo didn't know what would come next. But then Carter took a step back, his posture shifting from aggressive to contemplative. It was as though he were considering Theo's words, weighing the situation in his mind. Then, with one final glance at Theo, he spoke again, his voice now a low murmur. You'll never win this, no one does. With that, Carter turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. Theo stood in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had been so close to exposing everything. About Angelina Jolie's hidden past, about the web of corruption that surrounded her. But now, he wasn't sure how much of the truth could survive in a world so carefully constructed to keep it buried. As he closed the door and turned back into the dimly lit room, the weight of the consequences hit him full force. He was trapped. There was no way to expose the truth without risking his own life. The game was over before it had even really begun. He knew, as he sat down at his desk and looked at the files one last time, that this wasn't just a story about Jolie. This was about the people who controlled the narrative, who controlled the world. And as much as he wanted to bring it all to light, he realized one painful truth. The choice had never really been his to make.